Okay, well, let's get started. So hello everyone, and welcome to our seventh session of the 2022-2023 Forest and Climate Learning Exchange Series. I'm your host, Catherine Maloney, and I am the Interim Director for the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University. I want to give a quick thanks to our co-host, SAF. SAF is the National Scientific and Educational Organization representing forestry and related natural resources professionals across the United States. Founded in 1900, SAF promotes science-based, sustainable management and stewardship of the nation's public and private forests. Similarly, a thank you to our additional sponsors, NCX and Renew West. So for today's presentation, we'll be discussing remote sensing technology for improved forest carbon inventorying. We will hear from Monika Moskal, professor within the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. So thank you, Monika, for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly share a few housekeeping details. To automatically receive registration details and information regarding upcoming webinars, please join our mailing list by emailing forestc@msu.edu. A recording of this session, along with a copy of the slides and any supplemental resources, will be posted to our site. The presentations will be followed by a short Q&A. You can use the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom interface to submit your questions at any point during the presentations. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible. I know sometimes we have some folks that are only able to call in. If you are doing so, you can still submit your questions by sending us an email at forestc@msu.edu. Attendees are qualified to receive CFE credit from SAF. The credits will be automatically applied if you register for the event with the email associated with your SAF account. Similarly, attendees are qualified to receive CEU credits from ISA. Please email forestc@msu.edu to receive information necessary to receive those credits. And with that, I will hand it over to Monika.
Thank you. All right, just sharing my screen. And I think everyone can hopefully see that. Thank you for hosting this and having me here with you at Michigan State to virtually to talk about remote sensing technology for improved forest carbon inventory. I'll just jump right into it. So we live in pretty exciting times. This is an example of an autonomous robot dog scanning a forest with a LiDAR sensor. Now, these sensors have been around for a while. This particular sensor is mounted onto this robotic device. The work that I do mainly focuses on the data that we collect with these type of LiDAR or light detection and ranging sensors. And just to prove it to you, there's the LiDAR on the head of the Boston Dynamic Spot robotic dog. This is the sensor. So this is the toys that I've been playing around for about 17 years now here at the University of Washington. In fact, doing remote sensing as faculty for 20 years now. And again, to me, it's not the automation and autonomous vehicles. It's not the maneuvership through the forest. It's the data. It's the digital forest that I can put in my pocket and work on extracting information. And I think information that is particularly useful to characterizing forest structure, landscape structure at a very, very fine resolution. So what you see here is actually a pretty old data set. It's over a decade old. It's multiple scans of stationary LiDAR data that are colored with photography. Your classic photogrammetric remote sensing process where we're projecting the color from the photographs onto the points that the LiDAR sensor collects. And I mean, your imagination goes wild when you see this. You realize that you're truly capturing a lot of variability in our forest. Our brains are amazing. We're processing this data and seeing it as trees, trunks, and we can use these data sets to take all kinds of measurements from the forest. But of course, it all takes being able to code, figuring out the right algorithm to make this data useful. So I think that's where a lot of the advancements right now is the power of the algorithms to be able to utilize these data sets. I direct the Precision Forestry Co-op at the University of Washington, and I want to tell you a little bit more about it because it's not just me doing this work. There are actually 5 labs within the Precision Forestry Cooperative. One of those labs is my remote sensing and geospatial analysis lab, but we also have a spatial optimization lab led by Dr. Shander Toth. We have a fire landscape adaptive management ecology lab led by Dr. Susan Pritchard, and we have a forest resilience lab led by Dr. Van Kane. Now, right in the middle, there's one other lab right here. This is essentially our outreach lab. We don't have official outreach. However, the group, the Natural Resource Spatial Informatics group, takes all the research that we do in the other 4 labs within the Precision Forestry Co-op and really makes it operational and usable. We do have a broad advising board that comprises of public, private, non-profit, as well as industry sectors. And we have a lot of affiliates, and all these individuals help us to direct the research that the PFC does. We've been around since the 1990s. I took on the directorship of the Precision Forestry Co-op, or PFC, in 2013. And since then, we've had quite a bit of growth. So some of the labs that you see joined shortly thereafter me becoming the director of the PFC. And we've been able to broaden and increase the funding that we have. Right now, we've generated over $40 million of funding, published 200 plus papers, and extended our teaching beyond just the classroom by doing even workshops or outreach like this. We've had over 50 students. We have a really high job placement within the cohort of students that graduate. And a lot of them have that job placement because of the remote sensing tools and the spatial analytical techniques that we teach here in the PFC. So let's just talk about the labs a little bit, because I've said LiDAR is the tool to do a lot of this forest structure, forest carbon research. And in fact, we do utilize it quite a bit. Each one of our labs has developed techniques as well as furthered the knowledge of utilizing 3D structure out of LiDAR data. So for example, the Natural Resource Spatial Informatics group has been working with LiDAR since 2000, making it operational. And they collaborate quite a bit outside of the PFC, for example, looking at biomass mapping, which is the first step to forest carbon. If you want to know where the carbon is, you are interested in the biomass of the forests. They've also developed monitoring techniques for extensive riparian forests and looked at transferability of these techniques. So just because we develop a technique in one location, we're really interested in how can we utilize this 3-dimensional data across other landscapes. So some of that research comes out of that particular lab. Our newest lab, Dr. Susan Pritchard, has experience for over 25 years working with forest ecology. Her research is centered around landscape fire ecology, and some of her work has been utilizing LiDAR, specifically terrestrial LiDAR, with my student, Jonathan Batchelor, at looking at forest fuel moisture and forest fuels to really start to understand how the litter within the forest and other type of biomass and carbon within a forest can be collected and quantified with LiDAR data. Our Forest Resilience Lab has been doing quite a bit of LiDAR research. Dr. Kane's lab specifically focuses on using LiDAR data and looking at resilience of forests under climate change, as well as relating those things to land ownership and even policies that might exist on specific landscape. And of course, a lot of this is due to our ability to measure structures such as forest height consistently on large scales out of LiDAR data, as well as identify individual trees. And we're at an age where we're really seeing the trees in the forest with our LiDAR data. And I'm talking about aerial LiDAR. So if you would like, on June 2nd, there's a defense from one of our students who's going to be talking specifically how we can see the overstory of a forest and quantify changes in the canopy, basically the death of canopy due to drought per individual trees. So if you're monitoring carbon in a forest, you really do want to know which trees are photosynthesizing, which trees are dying, which trees are becoming fuel. All of these things within the PFC, these different labs, is interconnected. So often a data set could be produced by one lab and digested by another lab to, for example, look at mortality within a forest, and then the fuels lab looks at how that can impact fuels within the forest. Our spatial optimization lab, led by Dr. Shandor Toth, is also utilizing remote sensing to generate forest management units and really get at the specific structure information that we have in forests to drive optimization decisions, future decisions, decisions that tap into ecosystem services, one of them being carbon sequestration. And finally, my lab. So celebrating 20 years this June, actually, the Remote Sensing and Geospatial Analysis Lab. And I just want to give you a little bit of a background, kind of what drives me as a scientist. I've been at remote sensing since 1992. Started that, actually 1991 was the first time I laid eyes on aerial imagery of fires, and then started to look at aerial photography and landscape representation through aerial photography. But what really has driven me through my career is combining these threads of knowledge, water hydrology and that dimension of water and hydrology on the landscape, the forest canopy dimension, specifically 3D structure of forests, and then the human relationship that integrates these two other observations. So these are not separate themes. To me, they're unifying themes, and you can see how I tend to blend them through my research. So for example, in 2020, we started a project under the NASA carbon monitoring program, and it was a project to look at teal carbon. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in this presentation. And in fact, we're starting phase 2 of that project. We just found out it has been approved for funding, and we're hoping to start that research phase 2 in September. I do want to give you a little bit of a perspective of how I think of remote sensing, and perhaps let you think and understand remote sensing as you encounter it in your discipline, because this really drives my perspective as how we use remote sensing in the science that we do. And I like to think of remote sensing as a way of exploiting the different types of resolutions, the domains of resolution that we encounter in remote sensing. And what we're trying to do is to maximize those resolutions in my lab. So I like to call this the hyper resolution era. And specifically in the spatial domain, when I say hyper resolution, I do mean very fine spatial resolution of data, either taken out of UAS observations, aerial or drone, or out of aerial photogrammetry, 3D information, and specifically sub-meter observations of the landscape. The more little points or little pixels that I can get within a meter, the more excited my lab gets about being able to work with the data. The other resolution that I like to solve for is the temporal resolution. And this is the frequency of observation, but also the temporal scale, the length of time that we can look at a landscape. So with remote sensing, we have this unique opportunity to actually travel in time. We can go back to the mid-1930s and see the landscape from historic black and white aerial photographs. These are actually really powerful data sets because they've been collected in stereo overlap. So through photogrammetry, we can these days extract data at a 3-dimensional, very fine resolution from these historic photographs. And we can monitor that landscape right up to present dates with aerial photographs, with on-ground photogrammetry, with LiDAR, mixing and matching these different data sets to address landscape change over time. Now, there's also the frequency of observation along this gradient of time. For example, some data sets, you can fly a drone every hour if you want to look at observations and changes on the landscape, or you can look at webcams and see how the landscape or a particular location is changing at a very frequent minute by minute, second by second resolution. But we can also do that with large data sets like the Landsat. Since 1972, we've had a satellite data set that takes multi-observations of a location at a global extent. So not only do we have this temporal frequency with Landsat, we have a fairly long duration of time that we can monitor things on the landscape. Plus, the data is freely available for the globe. And finally, spectral resolution. So that's that resolution along the electromagnetic spectrum, going beyond the visible part of the spectrum, where we can see things such as physiological changes to vegetation related to health, or morphological characteristics, for example, related to species. So that's another resolution of remote sensing that we can mine for information. And of course, there is a fourth resolution that actually blends with the other three resolutions, and that is the quantization or the bit level of remote sensing. Now, ideally, what we would try to do is solve and maximize for all of these resolutions. In reality, we're never going to get it perfect because there are some other characteristics, pros and cons to mining these resolutions, and that is the data costs, the analytic time, and the accuracy. So when you look at these resolutions, you have to think about the pros and cons of having those resolutions, working with those resolutions, and also even the ability to have those resolutions. For example, with high spatial resolution, like historical aerial photographs, photographs collected by the National Agricultural Imagery Program, or NAIP, that spatial resolution is pretty amazing, meter and sometimes even sub-meter resolution. The older historical air photos are collected in stereo. Then we kind of miss some time there where we maximized the time that it would take to collect imagery at the cost of overlap. So we didn't have as much of the 3D resolution along the spatial spectrum of resolution domain from NAIP imagery to current acquisitions that actually allow us to do photogrammetry, digital photogrammetry of that aerial imagery, and again, get at 3D structure. It is passive remote sensing, which means we depend on sunlight as the source of an illumination. And when we have shadows, we have problems with those shadows. So other sensors, high resolution sensors like LiDAR, also can improve or add content to the information that we're collecting. LiDAR can be flown day or night. It's a active sensor. The illumination comes from the sensor. We don't need sunlight, and we don't have shadows in LiDAR data, although we do have occlusion, which you need to be aware of. However, when you maximize that spatial resolution, like the NAIP imagery or the LiDAR point cloud data sets, you really do lose out on the temporal resolution right now. So not many places have multiple LiDAR data collections, aerial LiDAR collections. The temporal resolution of NAIP is about every year, in the Pacific Northwest every other year. We also lose out on the spectral resolution of the data. So with NAIP imagery, in the optical region of the spectrum, we have the visible and often a near infrared band, but that's only 4 fairly wide regions of the electromagnetic spectrum versus hyperspectral data, which can monitor the environment at nano increments along the electromagnetic spectrum. So we can't have it all. We can't solve it for all. And then LiDAR only has one spectral band. Your intensity data is actually a spectral component of LiDAR data, which is kind of cool. You get a spatial data set, but you also mine the spectral data along one region, the near infrared region of most LiDAR acquisitions. There's also blue LiDAR and there is green LiDAR, but most aerial LiDAR is collected at near infrared, in the near infrared region. And as I mentioned, that's only one. There is hyperspectral LiDAR, still very not operational, very research type of a sensor. So cons and pros: data cost, analysis time, accuracy. These resolutions can be synergized, but that takes time. Of course, getting these data sets can cost a lot. Not everything comes to us freely. Some data sets like Landsat we can acquire out of the USGS archive. That wasn't free a few decades back. And currently the newest high resolution satellite data is something that has to be acquired or paid for. However, that synergy does allow you to increase your accuracy. So when you think about remote sensing, think about what's your acceptable accuracy to answer the question at hand, and perhaps think about the time that it's going to take to utilize all of these resolutions to get at the answer. And of course, it's all driven by the cost. And if you can't meet your cost goals or your accuracy goals, you might have to revise your research question and simplify your research question as well. And a final thought here, most remote sensing still today is done by looking at one resolution of, in one of the domains of resolution. So we either work with LiDAR or we work with optical imagery, satellite imagery, or aerial imagery. Once in a while, we are able to bring in two of those resolutions, and very infrequently do we tap into all of the three domains of remote sensing. Okay, let's talk research. So I've given you sort of background, what I do, how I think about remote sensing, and then I want to tell you some of the things that my lab has done over the last 20 years. So one of the bigger projects that we still work on is inventories and looking at structure, specifically in heterogeneous forests. That's what I'm interested in, is those forests that are really hard to model. Urban forest, riparian forest, not one species, extreme topographies. That's when it gets exciting for me, because that's when high resolution data, hyper resolution data really shines, including LiDAR, but not only limited to LiDAR. So we've been looking at forest inventories and really trying to focus in on areas of high uncertainty, areas of dense forest, areas of topography that can be very, very challenging. One of the tools that we use is leaf area index. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but literally the number of leaves over an area on the ground. And we've always believed that we need to fuse or utilize all resolutions of remote sensing available to us to capture key structural characteristics of a forest. So not just height, but species, DBH, really challenging things. Height is an easy variable these days to extract out of remotely sensed data. And I mentioned in the ecosystem service world, one of the things that you should know is that remote sensing has a really amazing tool that can serve different type of ecosystem service monitoring. And carbon is just in my framework, carbon is an ecosystem, carbon sequestration is an ecosystem service that we can monitor, and we can get at above ground carbon through looking at biomass. To get at biomass, one of the more unique things we can do is extract leaf area index. And we can do that with LiDAR by taking LiDAR point clouds and slicing them at different angles and trying to solve for that leaf area index variable. So that has been research in my lab for quite a while now. We started to work on this in 2006, 2007. We continue to improve on our techniques. And the amazing thing about leaf area index is that although we devised techniques to utilize terrestrial laser scanning to get at leaf area index, we can scale up LAI to other sensors because it's the same variable. It's the number of leaves over an area on the ground. So we can scale up to aerial LiDAR, we can scale up to spaceborne LiDAR, or other remote sensing variables. And we've also seen that LAI can be plugged in to other ecosystem service calculations, being a supporting ecosystem service, provisioning, cultural, regulating. Leaf area index can tell you a lot about evapotranspiration. It can tell you a lot about wildlife habitat. So it's this amazing variable that we can get out of remote sensing. And these days, we don't have to cut the trees down to count the number of leaves that we have. Although we did have to do that early on in our research. We literally had to destructively sample, which was the technique of doing leaf area index in the past. It's not anymore because, as you saw, we have these digital forests that we can put in our pockets, and we're hitting leaves and everything else on that tree at a millimeter resolution. So other LiDAR research within the lab, I've mentioned the quantifying forest litter for fuel moisture. I'm mentioning it again just to drive the point that the labs collaborate across labs. The other thing I want to tell you is this work is done by students. So Jonathan Batchelor, they're a student in the lab. They become the lead scientists and authors on this work. Guang Zheng was one of my first PhD students working on this LAI question. They're a professor now at Nanjing University, and we still continue to collaborate and work on these questions. Other things that we've been looking at from LiDAR. So using height as a proxy for above ground biomass is a common practice. We've started to look at utilizing structural metrics out of LiDAR to develop biomass estimation from above for above ground carbon determination. Now this work, although we started kind of independently looking at this, the Precision Forestry Co-op collaborates with a lot of board members, one of them being Andy Hudak. Please look at his work for above ground carbon, because his research really has utilized some of these techniques and has driven or pioneered a lot of this work. So the stuff that we do is supportive. We try and look at in areas with uncertainty. So this particular project looked at riparian zones and tried to look at above ground biomass specifically in riparian zones and map them across watersheds and then compare them between different watersheds as well. As we started to do that, we realized that if you think about carbon accounting, there's the above ground biomass, but there's also below ground biomass. And in riparian areas, that biomass is associated with wetlands or wet forests, wet areas. So not policy defined wetlands, but areas that have moisture in them. So my colleague and I, Dr. Megan Halabisky, were funded, wrote a proposal to NASA in 2019, were funded a year later to look at wetland carbon mapping. And the first thing we needed to do is really figure out where these wetlands are. So we developed this wetland intrinsic probability tool, WIP. Look it up, it's a plugin into ArcGIS now. And what it allows you to do is map along the moisture gradient on a landscape. We do utilize LiDAR, but we utilize the topography of LiDAR data and other things associated, other metrics associated with topography out of LiDAR to create these products. And then we can determine the function, or we want to, because we're still continuing to dive into this, the function of these wetlands on a wet landscape. All right, so let's get into carbon, and Andy is doing the above ground biomass and carbon. We're actually collaborators on his proposal within the PFC, myself and Dr. Van Kane. Andy also got the next phase of his above ground carbon funded. So we're really excited about that. But as with any good project, some of it really starts on social media. So a few years back, there was a post on social media by NASA about their carbon monitoring system program, that they're going to have some more funding in it. Caught my eye. It caught my eye because of the person in this picture. So this is a student and then a scientist in my lab, Kate Lagner, who led a team of scientists in Alaska to look at above ground biomass, to take the ground measurements that we need to drive remote sensing. And I have to emphasize, the remote sensing that my lab, my teams do is driven by ground observations. So we do go on the ground. We're not armchair remote sensing scientists. A lot of the models that we develop are driven by data that we collect on the ground. Anyway, we put in a proposal with Megan, and we were funded to do this stakeholder-driven monitoring of forested wetland carbon. Specifically, we realized we can digest Andy Hudak's data for the above ground carbon accounting. So we really focused on the below ground carbon accounting. And then I do want to point out, a lot of the work that we do is stakeholder driven, meaning we do the science that our stakeholders, board members are interested in. They tell us where we should go. They tell us what information do they want out of their carbon accounting programs. And again, we'll start September 2023, and we'll start with the stakeholders again to think about how to do large scale. Now, we started with the project in Washington State. Now we're going to scale out nationwide, and we'll be working with the stakeholders to think about how they need the information about below ground carbon out of the project that we have. So stakeholder driven, and you can see all of the stakeholders, and here's Andy Hudak. But I do want to tell you a little bit more. Why did we choose teal carbon? We chose teal carbon because wetland disproportionately contribute to carbon storage, storing about 30% of the global soil organic carbon stock, but only occupy 8 to 10% of the land surface. Due to that magnitude of carbon storage in inland wetlands, and Environmental Protection Service Agency person Amanda Nalick and a colleague referred to this as teal carbon. Amanda is, by the way, right there. She's a stakeholder on our project. So the goal of that first project was to improve wetland extent and baseline data carbon stock collection. And we had a few objectives to do that. Let me walk you through it. Now, when I say wetlands, I don't mean the policy defined wetlands. Wetlands are a difficult thing to define, and often we start these conversations with our stakeholders, asking them, what do you think wetlands are? What are wetlands? We do that because wetlands are cryptic. They're really challenging to work on. Specifically, remember, challenge, the thing that drives my lab, specifically when we look at things under a forest canopy. So in an air photo, you might be looking at a forested wetland here, and in fact you are, but you don't know that. Even if you went on the ground, you might look up and you're not really sure that, is this environment and ecosystem driven by moisture? Because if it is, it means it's storing a lot of carbon in the soils and below ground most of the time. You could look down And if you're a wetland ecologist, you might start to identify vegetation that is associated with wetlands. But really what you need to do is start digging. And that's when it gets hard. You need to dig soil pits and understand the soil to be able to determine if something is in fact functioning like a wetland on the landscape. Might be dry at the time that you're there. There's a hydro period, and it might be really short when this is truly open water wet, if it ever is. But the soil is going to tell you. The soil is also what we sample to get our carbon estimates or carbon measurements on the ground. So that was kind of the key thing about the project. Above ground carbon based on maps from HUDAC, and then below ground carbon driven by field sampling. And we wanted to look at the variation of stored carbon in forested wetlands across a moisture gradient. We got really lucky, or we're really lucky in the Pacific Northwest, that we have this moisture gradient in Washington State. So this is Washington State, Hoh National Park, and rainforest is right here. Moderate wetness here, Colville, a very dry forest. So that's a natural gradient that we were able to sample and drive these observations of variation. We also wanted to know how hydraulic position of wetlands connects to total carbon storage. And then to look at forest harvest practices and think about how that impacts carbon storage, below ground carbon storage, with the above ground accounting being taken out of HUDAC's models. So some results I've already mentioned, the wetland intrinsic potential tool, WIP. The really neat thing about WIP is it's very good at predicting moisture gradient across watersheds to extreme details. There's a paper on this tool now, and again, it's already a plugin in ArcGIS. Reach out if you're interested in using it. Within the Hoh watershed, we realized that we found 140% increase in the number, or in the wetland area identified by our WIP tool as compared to National Wetland Inventory. So we're capturing something that is not being captured by any other form of inventory or accounting on the landscape. And we know we're capturing this accurately because we have the field data to drive these models and to test these models. Again, WIP is an open source tool that you can plug into ArcGIS Toolbox, and we'll be working here shortly to make it function outside of Esri products as well. I mentioned the field sampling, so 97 pits in Washington State. I think we're actually at 98, approximately 1 meter depth. We also got lucky, and one of our stakeholders had some additional funding to do this for a watershed in Alaska. So we now tested and extrapolated our methods to a wet region along the Pacific Northwest in Alaska, and we're able to sample below ground carbon at these plots. Okay, some of the results, I won't be able to talk about it all, but we can see that wetlands had almost twice the soil carbon than upland forest. And although riverine wetlands had a much lower soil carbon estimate, a lot of the areas that we were detecting had quite a bit. there also seems to be a discrepancy between an assumption that we've been making as remote sensing scientists, myself included. We've been assuming that above ground carbon can be used to determine below ground carbon, and that the relationship is 1 to 2. So it's a biomass thing. We're assuming that if you have twice as much carbon below ground as you have above. And we knew that this could not be right, or we had a suspicion. Now we've been able to prove it. So this is the Ho study site, and I'm only going to show this particular example. And what you can see is that when we have a lot of above ground carbon, old large trees, we do have below ground carbon, but in areas that don't necessarily have a lot of trees or large old rainforest trees, we have quite a bit more carbon. So what this is telling us is that 1 to 2 relationship is false, and we have to be really careful because we're probably under accounting below ground carbon when we use that particular relationship. The other thing we were able to show is that when we use the WIP output to drive our carbon estimates, we're able to map that carbon at a much finer spatial resolution. And by doing so, we also show an increase in our models over what exists for these landscapes thus far. This is important because a lot of the managers on these landscapes are small forest landowners. A 250-meter pixel in their forest doesn't mean a lot to them, but our models are as fine resolution as that LiDAR driving the WIP tool is. They can be sub-meter resolution, which all of a sudden becomes a really attractive tool for small landowners and big landowners to use. Some other findings, so forested wetlands, and this does not include riverine, have higher above ground carbon. Wetter areas mean higher below ground carbon than lower above ground carbon. This plays a role in management. Stakeholders are asking for these level of products, and they do want to know where these wetlands are. So here's just an estimate for the Ho, and you can see for that whole region, it's quite dramatic. And what you're looking at here is above ground carbon and a wetness class. So very dry, very wet WIP tool class. What you're seeing is the dark areas are represented by not disturbed forests. So we started to look at disturbance out of the landscape LCMS models that use Landsat data. We looked at 50 years of protected forests. So if a forest has not been disturbed in 15 years, we represented it in green. And what you can see is that forests that are wetter tend to have less above ground carbon. The relationship is similar to below ground to above ground carbon for managed forests. So managed forests just have less carbon, but the relationship along the wetness gradient is similar. When you get to below ground carbon, the story starts to be a little bit different. So disturbed areas and managed forests versus undisturbed areas tend to have more below ground carbon as they change in their wetness. And this really becomes visible when you start to add up the carbon. So as you look at along the wetness gradient, you begin to see that above ground carbon decreases, but below ground carbon is still fairly strong for these forests. Some ongoing synthetic work, we wanted to show that areas that comprise terrestrial wetlands are still understudied. This really allowed us to leverage that lit review for the phase 2 future direction of research, which is to use the National Wetland Continuous Assessment EPA data inventories to perform this and scale this analysis at the continental scales. Lessons along the way, it takes a team. Stakeholders are key. Admit mistakes, they're actually opportunities. And as Anthony Stewart, the PhD student on the Teal Carbon project says, get messy and have fun. He has to say that to recruit all the undergraduate students. That also helped us dig all of those holes. So, oops, that's all I've got.
Well, thank you so much, Monika, for that presentation and for sharing about your work. With our remaining time, we'd like to move to the Q&A session. So we've been monitoring our chat for questions, but feel free to continue to add questions either to the Q&A function or in the chat function, or email us at forestc@msu.edu. There has been quite a bit of interest in your wetland probability tool and in the WIP model. And folks would like to know if that can be used outside of the Pacific Northwest. And if LiDAR data is required to run it, is that generally available in the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, you don't need LiDAR data to run it. You need topographic data, with the understanding that if you have a different data set, for example, synthetic aperture radar data that captures topography, that's going to be great. But there are blackout areas in that synthetic aperture radar data. That's where the model is going to be weak. You can use USGS or other topographic data, as long as it's a raster or a data set that you can rasterize, you can run the WIP tool on it. The question is, the accuracy of that tool is only as good as your ability to validate the tool. So what it gives you is a wetland gradient on the landscape. It's going to tell you this area is dry, probably an upland. This area is wet, probably an open body of water, and everything in between. Where you draw the boundary of where the wetland is should be driven by your ground knowledge, field knowledge, knowledge of the collaborators that you have on the project. We usually put that at 0.5, but you don't have to. And these are not, they're coordinate defined wetlands, but they're not policy defined wetlands. So we don't use the policy definition of wetlands to drive these models, but you might have to if that's what your project is, or if that's the data that you have. So approach it with all of that knowledge in mind, just like you would any other remote sensing or geospatial analysis project.
And I see some folks are interested in finding that plugin. So would you be able to share the link to that so that we can post it with the webinar?
I don't have that prepared right
Oh,
now.
no, you don't need it right now.
Okay.
You can
Okay.
provide it later.
If you go to the Precision Forestry Co-op website, under publication, the WIP tool paper is listed there. From that paper, you can get to the GitHub depository for the software.
Are there radar techniques for remote sensing to monitor ecosystem services in dense forests, such as the rainforests in the tropics?
Yeah, great question. So the tropics are challenging with optical data because of clouds. LiDAR is frequently not flown over those areas because they're really challenging to fly. There are radar spaceborne data sets that look promising. I think the research is not operational, but exploratory. But I think radar is a possibility. Don't think just LiDAR and you can't do it. It's getting at the high resolution spatial domain that you want for monitoring carbon in tropical areas, and you can get that through radar. So yeah, I would definitely pay attention to that domain of remote sensing and to those tools. It's not my area of expertise because in the Pacific Northwest we have LiDAR. We have compared, and we actually even ran the WIP tool on IFSAR data, and it's great. Actually, we used that in Alaska because we didn't have LiDAR there. So you know, if you can have aerial IFSAR, great. If you can start looking at spaceborne radar data sets, that would be, I think, the next step.
There's been an increased focus on the co-benefits or related ecosystem services of carbon projects. And I'm wondering, what opportunities do you see or interest do you see for remote sensing and measuring ecosystem services related to carbon projects?
Yeah, I like to think of ecosystem services as holistic ecosystem services. When you start to look at one with remote sensing, you can probably get at some other ecosystem service as well. That's why I get so excited about leaf area index, because that variable can be plugged into so many things that we do: evapotranspiration, habitat modeling, shading of streams and riparian zones. So it's extremely promising, but it boils down to vegetation structure. That's what leaf area index is. It's a measure of vegetation structure. If you can measure vegetation structure, you have some powerful tools to address your ecosystem service needs.
One of your slides that focuses on understanding remote sensing through the domains of resolution, the one with the triangle.
Yep.
You mentioned that access, equity, and inclusion have a way to go. Can you unpack that a little?
Sure. So you can't see it, but my bias, being a female in a male-dominated discipline, actually straddling multiple disciplines, remote sensing and forestry, heavily male, white scientist, global north dominated areas, I see that we still need to provide pathways to inclusion. One of those pathways that I'm excited about is Ladies of Landsat. It's a group of female scientists, and there are adjacent groups like Sisters of SAR and a few others that are really trying to bring in gender, the global south, race diversity into geospatial sciences. And we have to address that from multiple angles, from the top, through policies, and from the bottom, from activism. So I'm excited mainly to see how my students are able to contribute and really grow equity and access in our discipline. Equity, you know, if you can't afford to have your children in daycare as a female, you're not going to have time to learn fairly complex techniques to do remote sensing. So that's just an example. If you live in an area where data, remotely sensed data, isn't freely available to you, that becomes another challenge. Although there's always Landsat, it's global, it's free. Course resolution challenges that come from that, but it's there. And if you can start with that, of course, you're still going to have to address the having access to that data, being able to download it, having the infrastructure to analyze it, including open source software to do it. Open source data and open source software, because you might not be able to afford some of the more advanced software licenses that are used at the cutting research level of analysis. And then having educational outreach programs that really address equity. You know, if you're a caregiver, maybe you need to be taking courses that are in the evenings, asynchronous, not your traditional educational pathway. What SAF is actually doing through these courses is providing the outreach and education and being able to gain credit through non-traditional ways.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time here, despite having many questions that we could continue to ask. I'd like to thank you again for your time and for sharing about your work. The webinar recording and slides and assuming some supplemental materials, we've had some requests for links to papers and such, will be posted on our website in approximately 1 week. The slides will also be included with that. To be included on our mailing list to receive registration details and information regarding upcoming webinars and other activities, please email forestc@msu.edu. Monika, again, thank you so much, and you all have a wonderful afternoon.